Hey everyone, welcome back to Conviction Bet. Hope you're doing well. It's been a strange few weeks if you own anything with a chip in it. Semiconductors got taken apart for most of a month. The whole complex looked structurally broken. Then the buyers came charging back in, and then the whole thing wobbled again, all inside about 3 sessions, right as earnings season hits its heaviest stretch. The biggest names in technology are in the middle of reporting. The Fed meets next Tuesday and Wednesday, and everyone is working very hard to sound calm about all of it. And speaking of calm, last week the market had decided that AI hardware was a broken trade. On Tuesday, it decided those same names were a bargain. By Wednesday, it wasn't sure again. Same chips, same fabs, same customers. Nothing about those businesses moved that fast. The price did, which does raise the question of what exactly we've been analyzing. But here's what I actually want to talk about. In early 1999, Stanley Druckenmiller looked at internet stocks and concluded they were a bubble. He shorted $200 million of them. He was early, he covered at a loss of around $600 million. By early 2000, 2 young traders down the hall at Quantum, running a fraction of his capital, were up about 50% on the year. As he tells it, his own book was up about 7. He says he picked up the phone 3 times in 1 week and put it back down, telling himself not to do it. Then he did it. He bought $6 billion of technology stock. He figures he missed the top by about an hour. The Nasdaq set its record close on March 10th, 5,048, and would not see that level again for 15 years. 6 weeks later, he was down $3 billion. And on April 28th, George Soros held a press conference to announce that Quantum was down 22% and Druckenmiller was leaving. The market tells that as a story about who was right about the internet. The real story is that he was right about the internet. He had the analysis, he had the thesis, he had run money for 2 decades without a losing year, and none of that was the part that failed. I'm JL Maurer, and this is Conviction Bet. We believe the stories that move your portfolio are usually quieter than the ones that move the tape. Here's where we're going. I'm going to argue that for a lot of investors, at the moments of maximum pressure, the binding constraint is not access to one more piece of information. It's whether you can follow a sound process once the price starts moving. Then I'm going to show you what actually fixed it in a 1954 experiment where all 20 subjects failed the first test, and why the fix had nothing to do with staying calm. And along the way, the uncomfortable parts. For 25 years, professional funds with the word value in their legal name have been quietly leaning toward growth. They drift. It buys them nothing, and the only portfolios in the study that held their discipline were the ones with no feelings at all. Let's start with what Druckenmiller's mistake actually was, because it's easy to file it under even the greats get it wrong and move on. That filing is comfortable and it is incorrect. He didn't get the valuation call wrong. Where he got it wrong was timing and sizing, and I want to be fair about that, because timing and sizing aren't footnotes attached to an investment decision. They are the decision. Being early cost him $600 million before he ever capitulated. But then he abandoned his own thesis entirely for reasons he could name out loud at the time. His own description afterward was that he was just an emotional basket case and couldn't help himself. Notice what's missing from that sentence. There's no new information in it. Nothing arrived between January and March of 2000 that changed the internet. What changed was that 2 guys down the hall were up 50 and he was up 7. Now hold that next to the other man who saw the same bubble. Julian Robertson started Tiger Management in 1980 with $8.8 million. 18 years later, the firm managed about $21 billion. And I want to be careful with that number because its assets under management, most of it walked in the door as new money from new investors. It is not what happened to the original stake. The performance figure is the one that matters, and it's this. Over those first 18 years, partners earned 31.7% a year after fees. And then came the losses. So by the time he closed the funds, $1 invested at inception was worth about $85 net of fees, better than 3 times what the S&P 500 delivered. and a good deal less than the first 18 years alone would have given you. By his own reckoning, no one had a better record, and I've not found anyone willing to argue with him. Then he looked at internet stocks and reached exactly Druckenmiller's conclusion that the whole thing was a pyramid that would eventually collapse under its own weight. And unlike Druckenmiller, he held Tiger lost 4% in 1998 and 19% in 1999, while the Nasdaq went vertical, and then another 10.5% in the first 3 months of 2000. Assets went from about $22.5 billion in the summer of 1998 to around $6 billion. Investors pulled roughly $7.7 billion out from under him. In March of 2000, he wrote his final letter, said he saw no reason to keep taking risk in what he called a market which I frankly do not understand, and shut the firm. The Nasdaq peaked that same month. He was so right that the market waited for him to close the doors before proving it. So here are two of the best investors of their generation reaching the same broad conclusion about the mania, and both of them get destroyed by it. One capitulated and lost $3 billion. One held and lost his firm. Their portfolios weren't the same. Their shorts weren't the same. Their capital wasn't the same. And that last one matters enormously, as we'll see. And I want to be precise about the thing they have in common, because it isn't the market is unknowable. It's that in both cases, the core valuation concern was in place years before the outcome, and everything that decided the result happened after the thinking was done. The trade wasn't decided in the research. It was decided in the 18 months of sitting inside a position that was hurting while other people got rich. So if you're sitting there with a reading list, telling yourself that one more report on the AI CapEx cycle will finally get you positioned right, remember that Druckenmiller had already done the work on his own bubble. He'd written the thesis. More analysis was not what stopped him from overriding it. Now, let me tell you why this happens, because control your emotions is advice, and I'd rather give you a mechanism. There's a thing that happens to pilots called spatial disorientation, and once you understand how it works, I don't think you can unsee it in markets. Your sense of balance lives in your inner ear in 3 fluid-filled loops called the semicircular canals. They're accelerometers. They detect change in rotation, and they have 2 limits that matter enormously. The first is a floor. Below roughly 2 degrees per second, they detect nothing at all. If an aircraft rolls into a bank slowly enough, your body registers no bank whatsoever. The second is worse. After 10 to 20 seconds in a steady turn, the fluid catches up with the motion, the signal fades, and the sensation of turning simply stops. You are in a turn. Your body reports level flight. Then it gets recursive. Pilots call the next part the graveyard spiral. The unnoticed bank means the aircraft is no longer holding altitude, so the nose drops and the altimeter starts unwinding. And here's the trap. Because the turn has stopped feeling like a turn, the pilot experiences all of this as a wings-level descent, losing height, straight and level. So the obvious correction is to pull back. But in a bank, pulling back doesn't raise the nose. It tightens the turn and steepens the descent. So the altitude goes faster, which feels like a worse descent, so the pilot pulls harder. Every correction makes it worse, and every single one of them feels like the right thing to do. And there's a second one that I find almost unbearably apt. It's called the Coriolis illusion. If you're in a turn long enough for the fluid to settle, and then you move your head, quickly glance down at a chart, look over at a switch, the fluid starts moving in a different plane, and your brain reports that the aircraft is tumbling on an axis. It isn't tumbling on. The standard instruction is to keep head movements to a minimum while scanning the panel. In other words, in cloud, the act of looking around is itself a hazard. I'll let you draw your own conclusion about checking your portfolio 9 times a day during a drawdown. That is the metaphor for this whole episode, so let me make it explicit. Your investment framework is the instrument panel. Your gut is the vestibular system. In clear air, they agree, and because they agree, you never find out which one you're actually flying. The disagreement only shows up in cloud, and in cloud, the instrument is right, and the feeling is wrong, and the feeling is the one that is absolutely certain. Now, one place this metaphor breaks, and I want to flag it early because I'm coming back to it. An attitude indicator is calibrated against physical reality. Your investment framework is not. It can simply be wrong. Hold that thought. In 1954, researchers at the University of Illinois ran an experiment on this. They took 20 pilots with no instrument training, put them in an aircraft none of them had flown before, covered the attitude, heading, and vertical speed indicators, loaded the aircraft to make it harder to handle, took away the visual references, and asked them to hold control and turn back out. All 20 lost control. In the study's own numbers, the times ranged from 20 seconds to 8 minutes. The average was 178 seconds. You may have heard that number before, attached to a phrase, 178 seconds to live. I want to flag that this is a myth, and I'd rather hand you the honest version. That study was not measuring survival time. That was the baseline measurement taken before the actual experiment. Hold on to that, because the real finding is the most useful thing in this episode, and I'm going to come back to it. Here's what the baseline does tell you, though. Not one of those pilots was panicking about a portfolio. There was no money at stake, no drawdown, nobody down the hall getting rich. They simply had an organ in their head producing confident, incorrect information at a speed that beat their capacity to reason about it. Their problem was not a character flaw. It was a sensor with a known failure mode operating exactly as designed. So when you feel the pull to sell into a drawdown or the pull to buy a name that's tripled while you sat out, that feeling is not weakness. And it may well be telling you something true, that the position is larger than you can actually carry, or that you need the money sooner than you admitted. Those are real signals, and you should listen to them. What that feeling is not is evidence that the thesis changed. It's a sensor doing what it evolved to do on a timescale where being fast mattered more than being right. Which means there are two risks here, and only one of them gets talked about. The obvious one is that your framework is wrong. The one nobody plans for is that your framework is right, and you override it at precisely the moment it's the only thing keeping you level. But that's only half the story. Because so far, this is two anecdotes and a metaphor, and I don't want you taking a behavioral thesis on vibes. So let's put numbers on it. In 1998, Terence Odian published a study in the Journal of Finance using the complete trading records of 10,000 accounts at a discount broker from 1987 through 1993. He asked a very clean question. When investors sell, do they sell winners or losers relative to how many of each they had available to sell? The answer: they cashed in 14.8% of their available winning positions and 9.8% of their losers. Which means that on a day when one of these investors sold something, a winning position was about 50% more likely to be the thing that got sold than a losing one. Now, there are innocent explanations for that, and Odian went after them one at a time. Rebalancing, he reran it counting only complete exits and only trades with no new purchase within 3 weeks. The pattern held. Avoiding the higher trading costs of beaten down, low-priced stocks, he sliced it by price bucket and by size of gain or loss. 14 of 15 buckets pointed the same way, and 13 of them significantly. Maybe they were right, and the losers they held were about to come back? Not in this data. Over the following year, the winners they sold beat the losers they kept by 3.4 percentage points. And Odian went one level deeper into why. The whole thing turns on something called a reference point, the number in your head that a position is measured against, the line that separates up from down. For a lot of investors, without ever deciding to, that number is the price they paid. Now, that number wasn't necessarily arbitrary when you set it. You may have done real work to arrive at it. But the price you paid is not, by itself, evidence of what the business is worth today. It's a fact about your transaction that quietly becomes a substitute for a current valuation. He uses a lovely example. A woman buys a house for $100,000 right before a boom. It gets appraised at $200,000. If she later sells it for $100,000, has she broken even? Arithmetically, obviously yes. Psychologically, absolutely not, and she will not experience it that way for a second. The reference point moved up to 200 without her permission. And once you see that, the second finding in the paper stops being surprising and starts being alarming. Odeon also measured which existing positions people added to, not which they sold, which they bought more of. On days when these investors bought, they added to their losing positions at a rate of 13.5% and to their winning positions at 9.4%. Averaging down was measurably more common than adding to what was working. Now, adding to something that has fallen can be exactly the right move. If the price dropped further than the value did, you're being handed a better deal, and you should take it. The graveyard spiral is the other version, when the reason you're adding isn't an improved expected return, it's the pull to drag your average purchase price back toward the market price. That's the pilot pulling back on the yoke. It feels like a correction. It steepens the descent. He even priced it. Take an investor holding one winner and one loser, needing to raise $1,000. If he sells the winner instead of the loser, the thing these accounts did over and over, Odeon's arithmetic on the average position in his data puts the cost at about 4.4% of that $1,000 over the following year on a 15% tax rate, assuming gains to offset once you count the deferred tax benefit he gave up and the performance difference between the stock he kept and the stock he sold. Now, that's an illustration under stated assumptions, not a bill that lands in every investor's account. But it puts a number on something people treat as free the cost of deciding which position to close based on which one hurts less to admit. That's the shape of the damage, and I want you to sit with the shape rather than the size. It isn't that people trade badly at random, it's that the error has a direction. Gains get realized early, which truncates the upside. Losers get held, which lets more of the downside actually happen. You can be right half the time and still lose money because you've engineered your winners to be small while giving your losers all the room they need. And before anyone comforts themselves that this is a retail problem, Vanguard published an analysis in October of 2025 using Morningstar data covering January 2000 through December 2024 on large cap active equity funds in the United States, the ones Morningstar files under large value and large growth with the word growth or the word value written into their legal name. They're finding large value funds persistently tilt toward growth away from the benchmark that defines them, not occasionally, persistently across 25 years. And the drift buys them nothing. It doesn't predict which style is about to win, and it doesn't reliably follow the style that just won. Vanguard's own line is that the one guaranteed result of buying outside your style is the drift itself. There's one group in that study that stuck far closer to style. The index funds. Dryly, which is a hell of a control group when you think about it. The portfolios that held their discipline for 25 years were the ones that don't have to watch anybody else get rich. One more, because it closes the loop on cost. Barber and Odeon. 2000 Journal of Finance, again, about 66,000 households at a discount broker between 1991 and 1996. The households that traded most earned 11.4% a year. The market returned 17.9%. The average household turning over 3/4 of its portfolio every year earned 16.4%. And here's the part that indicts the whole enterprise. Before costs, the 5 turnover groups were tightly clustered. Gross returns ran from 18.5% to 18.7%. The author's own conclusion is that it's the cost of trading and the frequency of trading, not portfolio selection, that explains the performance. And there's one detail about that paper I've always loved. Before the abstract, before a single table, Barber and Odeon put an epigraph at the top of it. One sentence, written in 1949 by a man who never saw a discount brokerage account in his life. I'll give it to you at the end. And I want to be precise about what that does and does not show. Vanguard measured drift. It did not measure fear or envy or loss aversion, and it cannot tell you why those managers drifted. What it does tell you is narrower and still damning. A written mandate, a legal name, a stated philosophy, a category on a fact sheet is not the same thing as disciplined execution. And the gap between the two ran for 25 years. So the investor implication is not try harder to be disciplined. It's that the individual version of this is a measurable, directional haircut with a known shape, and that writing the discipline on the front of the fund does not close it. So here's where it gets interesting. Because buried in Odeon's data is 1 month where the entire pattern reverses. December. Across the full year, investors sold winners far more readily than losers. From January through November, it isn't close. 15.2% of gains realized against 9.4% of losses. Then December arrives and it inverts. 10.8% of gains, 12.8% of losses. Suddenly, the thing they could not bring themselves to do for 11 months, they do. And we don't need to assume they got braver in December. What plainly changed is the decision environment. The tax year was ending, and realizing a loss now carried an external economic benefit that it didn't carry in June. Scheffer and Statman predicted this in 1985, before anyone had the account data to check. Their reading was that December selling works as a self-controlled device. The calendar supplies a reason to act that doesn't require the investor to frame the sale purely as an admission of error. Now, I want to be careful here because the December data is also perfectly consistent with plain tax optimization. Odeon says so himself in the paper. But notice that both explanations land in the same place. Whether the investor is being disciplined by the calendar or by the tax code, the thing that produced the behavior was external to him. I think that's one of the most useful findings in behavioral finance, and it gets buried because it looks like a footnote about taxes. But read it again as what it is. The data cannot tell us how much of that December flip is self-control and how much is plain tax arithmetic. What it can tell us is that the behavior changed when the decision environment changed and not when anything about the investor did. So flip the whole self-improvement framing on its head. The goal is not to become a person who doesn't feel the pull. If that person exists, they're rare enough that I wouldn't build a plan around becoming one. Ask the 20 pilots, ask Druckenmiller. The goal is to make the decision earlier in writing at a time when you're in clear air, and then to make the later version of you obey it. And here's the part almost nobody does, which follows directly from the reference point. If your brain is going to install a scoreboard, whether you choose one or not, then choosing one is the highest leverage thing available to you. Watch how most people actually build a portfolio. They start at the last step, which fund, which stock, which chip name, and they never do the step before it, which is deciding what the money is for, what it has to pay for, and when. That sounds like soft financial planning language, and it is not. It is load-bearing, and here's why. If the purpose of the money is more, you have set yourself an objective with no stopping point. There is no number at which more is satisfied. And a portfolio with no stopping point cannot be evaluated against itself, so it gets evaluated against the only other thing available, which is what everyone else made. That's an unbounded comparison, and it re-anchors every single week to whatever just went up. Druckenmiller's reference point in March of 2000 was not a business or a valuation or a target. It was 2 guys down the hall. You cannot beat that comparison. Somebody is always up 50. Whereas if the money has a job, a defined amount for a defined thing by a defined date, then the question, am I on track, has an answer that doesn't depend on anyone else's year. The scoreboard becomes closed instead of open. That is not a comforting sentiment. That is the practical mechanism that makes the guy down the hall a great deal less interesting. Then, and only then, the rules. That's what Buffett's punch card is. He's told business school students for decades. Imagine you were handed a card with 20 slots on it when you graduated, 1 punch per investment, and when it's full, you're done for life. He's not describing a portfolio limit. He's describing a device that makes a decision expensive before you feel anything about it. You cannot punch that card because 2 guys down the hall are up 50%. Now, let me deal with the version of this that's being sold to you, because there's an industry attached. You've probably heard that meditation physically rewires your brain, shrinks the amygdala, thickens the prefrontal cortex, and thereby installs the calm you've been missing. Carefully, I looked into that, and the evidence is a lot weaker than the pitch. In May of 2022, a team led by Tammy Krall, with Richard Davidson as senior author, published in Science Advances what they called the largest and most rigorously controlled study of this to date. 218 meditation-naive people, randomly assigned to an 8-week mindfulness course, a matched active control, or a waitlist, scanned before and after. They set out to replicate the structural findings. They failed. No difference in gray matter volume, density, or cortical thickness, not against the active control, not against the waitlist. And I want to be fair to them, because this is a group that published a result cutting against their own prior work, which is not the normal incentive structure in science. What the same lab did find in earlier work on one of those two samples was a great deal narrower and, I think, more interesting. Not a change in the size of the amygdala, but a change in its behavior. Lower reactivity in the right amygdala to positive images specifically, and stronger coupling between the amygdala and the prefrontal region that does the deliberating. So the structure didn't move. One functional response shifted in one sample, which is a much more modest claim than rewire your brain, and it points somewhere useful. Because here's the thing, you don't need the neuroscience to hold up. Go back to those 20 pilots in 1954. Remember I said the average time to loss of control was the baseline, not the finding? Here's the finding. The researchers then taught them a specific escape procedure, a controlled turn on instruments, a defined sequence of actions to run when the horizon disappears. About 6 hours of instruction, then they put them back in the cloud. By the study's accounts, all but one of them held control and made the turn. Same pilots, same illusion. Nobody's inner ear got better. Nobody achieved a state of calm at 4,000 feet in cloud. What changed was that they now had a procedure that ran without requiring the feeling to go away first. And that's exactly what instrument training teaches to this day. Believe the instrument, disbelieve the sensation, hold it there until the sensation passes. So the investor version, concretely. Before you need it while nothing is falling, write down the 3 things you refuse to leave to the moment. What would actually have to happen for me to sell? A change in the business, a change in my estimate of what it's worth, the price running far enough past that estimate, or the position breaking my own risk limit. Anything except it went down. What is the largest share of this portfolio one idea is allowed to be, even when I'm certain? And what am I contractually obliged to do on a day when everything is down and I feel like doing something? Write it down, because the version of you reading it will not be the version of you who wrote it. That's the entire point. And I know what the bear case is here. It goes something like this. Discipline is just the word underperformers use for stubbornness. The market is an information system. If it's been telling you you're wrong for 3 years, the humble response is to consider that you are wrong, that your model of the world has aged out. Robertson had discipline. Discipline cost him his firm. And anyone who's held a value framework against the AI complex since 2023 has paid a fortune for the privilege of feeling principled. That is a legitimate concern. And this is where the metaphor breaks the thing I told you to hold on to. An attitude indicator does not have opinions about the future. Your framework does. It can be built on assumptions that quietly stopped being true. And I'll go further. It's partly correct, and the Robertson case proves it. At the time, from the outside, and honestly from the inside, a correct framework held through a mania is indistinguishable from a wrong one held through stubbornness. In the moment, from the inside, they can be desperately hard to tell apart. That's not a rhetorical concession. That's the actual epistemics. But here's where it survives. The test was never whether you change your mind. Changing your mind is fine. Changing your mind is required. The test is what changed it. And I want to be careful, because there's a lazy version of this that I don't believe. A price is real information. It can carry things you don't know, an earnings revision you haven't seen, a financing problem, somebody trading on something you'd want to know about. Ignoring price entirely is its own kind of blindness. But a price is not proof that value has changed. So the discipline I'm describing isn't never sell, and it isn't never buy the thing that's working. It's that a large move should trigger a re-underwriting, not a trade. and you re-underwrite against 3 questions, not 2. Has the business changed? Has my estimate of what it's worth changed? Or has only the mood changed? And there's a sharper version of the objection I should take, which is that stay in your circle of competence is a phrase that can be used to justify never learning anything again. If your framework was built in a world of stable cash flows and predictable capital cycles, and the economy has since reorganized itself around a technology that breaks both, then a circle of competence is just a nice word for a blind spot. That's real. I'd say the honest answer is that the circle is supposed to be expanded deliberately in slow time with work and never on a Tuesday because something went up. The tell is the timing. Expanding your competence takes months and starts with reading. Capitulation takes an afternoon and starts with a price. Run Druckenmiller through it. Between January and March of 2000, what thesis-changing fact drove the reversal? By his own account, none. He already knew he wasn't supposed to do it. The decisive input was 50% versus 7%. Run Robertson through it, and the answer is genuinely different. And it isn't about temperament at all. He was right. On the correct horizon, running capital that could walk out the door on a much shorter one. Investors withdrew $7.7 billion. That is a structural mismatch between the holding period of his thesis and the holding period of his money. And he chose that structure. He decided to run outside money on terms that let it leave. But what became binding in the end wasn't his temperament. It was his investor's time horizon, which is, I'd argue, the most underrated advantage a private investor has. Nobody can redeem you. No investor committee is going to call in August and ask why you're not in the thing that's working. Plenty of things can still force your hand margin, tax, a lost job, a real emergency. But nobody is going to take the portfolio away from you because you lagged for 18 months. Which leaves a very short list of people who can force you out of a correct position early. Mostly, it's you. So let's bring this back to where we started. In the space of about 3 sessions this month, semiconductors were structurally broken, then they were cheap, then nobody was sure. Somewhere in there, a lot of people who describe themselves as long-term investors made decisions. And I'd bet most of those decisions were made after the price moved. Not after anything about the businesses moved. That's the leans. That's the fluid catching up in the canal and reporting straight and level while the aircraft is in a bank. So here's that sentence from the top of the paper. Benjamin Graham, writing in the introduction to The Intelligent Investor. The investor's chief problem and even his worst enemy is likely to be himself. Buffett, in his preface to the same book, made the structure of it explicit that succeeding over a lifetime doesn't require a stratospheric IQ or inside information, but a sound framework and the ability to keep your emotions from corroding it. Graham supplies the framework, Buffett said. You have to supply the discipline yourself. So here's where I land. Pause. A sound framework is half of it. The other half is the state you're in when you have to use it. And you do not fix that half by becoming a calmer person. You fix it by writing the decision down before the horizon disappears and then flying the instruments when your body starts screaming that they're wrong. Anyway, that's this week. If you're enjoying Conviction Bet, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, whatever you use. Leave a review if you have 30 seconds. It genuinely helps new listeners find the show. Until next time, stay patient, stay skeptical, and keep your eye on the quiet stuff. I'm J.L. Maurer. This has been Conviction Bet.